The bells of Assisi echoed across the Umbrian hills as another peaceful evening settled over the city. Behind the towering stone walls of one of its wealthiest palaces, however, a silent battle had already begun, one that no sword could end. Clare of Assisi was born around 1193 into one of the most influential noble families in Assisi. Her father, Favarone di Offreduccio, belonged to the city's military aristocracy, while her mother, Ortolana, was remembered for her deep piety and pilgrimages to sacred places long before such journeys were considered safe for women. From childhood, Clare was surrounded by luxury. Silk garments, silver goblets, elaborate banquets, and servants attended to her every need. Her future seemed carefully written long before she could read: a politically advantageous marriage, greater wealth for her family, and a life admired by society. Yet beneath the elegance of the palace, another desire quietly grew. While noble families competed for influence and power, whispers spread through Assisi about a young man who had abandoned everything. Francis, the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, had renounced his inheritance, embraced poverty, and wandered the countryside preaching repentance, peace, and complete trust in God. Many mocked him as a fool. Others believed they were witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. Clare listened. Every story she heard about Francis stirred something within her that no luxury had ever awakened. She secretly met with him through trusted intermediaries, asking questions about the gospel, sacrifice, and the meaning of a life completely surrendered to God. Francis did not promise comfort. He spoke instead of hardship, humility, and freedom found only through detachment from earthly possessions. His words became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, her relatives accelerated preparations for her marriage. Noble alliances were not matters of affection. They were transactions of land, prestige, and political influence. Clare understood that once the wedding was celebrated, every possibility of choosing another path would disappear forever. She made her decision. On the evening of Palm Sunday in 1212, while the city celebrated the beginning of Holy Week, Clare attended Mass wearing magnificent noble garments, exactly as everyone expected. To those around her, she appeared calm. Inside, however, every heartbeat carried the weight of an irreversible choice. Late that night, after the palace had fallen silent, she rose from her bed. No servants accompanied her, no farewell was spoken. The moon illuminated the ancient stone corridors as she moved carefully through the darkness, avoiding every creaking floorboard. She could not risk opening the main gate. Guards remained nearby, and discovery would mean immediate capture. Instead, tradition recounts that she headed toward a little-used opening in the palace wall, remembered in local tradition as the Door of the Dead. Such narrow exits were associated with funeral processions, opened only on rare occasions to allow coffins to leave the house before being sealed once more. Removing the heavy stones demanded remarkable strength and absolute silence. Each stone she loosened seemed to symbolize another part of the life she was leaving behind. Her noble title, her inheritance, her family's expectations, her very identity. By the time she stepped through that narrow passage into the cold night air, it was as though the daughter of one of Assisi's richest families had vanished forever. The young woman who walked into the darkness intended never to return. Outside the city, Francis and several companions waited for her near the tiny chapel of the Porziuncola, illuminated only by candles. There was no magnificent cathedral, no orchestra, no feast worthy of aristocrats. Only prayer. There, before the altar, Clare knelt. Francis took scissors and slowly cut away her long golden hair, a striking symbol in medieval Europe. A woman's hair represented beauty, social status, and often the expectation of marriage. By cutting it short, Clare publicly renounced the future that her family had carefully prepared for her. He then clothed her in a simple penitential garment and placed a humble veil over her head. In that quiet chapel, without soldiers, witnesses of importance, or legal documents, one of history's most influential religious movements for women quietly began. But dawn would bring consequences. When the Offreduccio family discovered Clare's disappearance, panic quickly turned into fury. A missing daughter was already a scandal. A noblewoman abandoning her fortune to embrace voluntary poverty was unthinkable. Her father and male relatives gathered armed retainers and immediately began searching throughout the countryside. They soon learned that Clare had first been sheltered among the Benedictine sisters, before eventually being moved for greater safety. Their destination became clear. They stormed into the religious house with the force of men convinced that family honor had been stolen. Their voices shattered the silence of the monastery. The sisters watched helplessly as armed nobles pushed through the sacred enclosure, demanding that Clare be returned immediately. They seized her. Some accounts describe her being dragged toward the entrance despite her desperate resistance. The overwhelming strength of armed men left the young woman with little hope of escaping by physical force alone. Then she made one final, desperate decision. Throwing herself toward the sanctuary, Clare grasped the altar cloth with all the strength she possessed. According to medieval custom, the altar represented sacred asylum. Violating its protection was considered an act of grave sacrilege. Her relatives shouted. They pulled violently at her arms. The fabric tightened beneath her fingers. When they attempted to strip away her veil and restore her to noble life, Clare revealed the shocking sight hidden beneath it. Her hair was gone. Her head had been closely shorn. For medieval society, this was no ordinary haircut. It was the unmistakable sign that she had consecrated herself entirely to God. The transformation stunned even her furious relatives. The elegant, aristocratic daughter they had come to reclaim no longer existed. Standing before them was a woman who had willingly abandoned privilege, security, wealth, and even the protection of her powerful family, for a calling that neither threats nor violence could erase. For several long moments the struggle ceased. No sword was drawn. No blood stained the sanctuary. Yet everyone present understood that an invisible battle had ended, and that nothing in Assisi would ever be the same again. Had you ever heard of Saint Clare before today? Have you or anyone you know ever received a blessing, a miracle, or the intercession of Saint Clare? Write it down in the comments below. I read every single one of your comments, and I'll leave a heart on yours. If this story warms your heart, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family so they can strengthen their faith too. The saints were forgotten once, and together, we will never let that happen again. The siege of the barbarians and the invisible weapon. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Clare escaped her family's palace and surrendered her noble life beneath the flickering candles of the Porziuncola. The frightened 18-year-old who had once clung desperately to an altar had become the spiritual mother of a growing community of women. At the small monastery of San Damiano, outside the protective walls of Assisi, Clare and her sisters lived according to a rule that appeared almost impossible to the medieval world. They owned no land from which to draw wealth, accumulated no personal possessions, and refused the financial security normally granted to religious communities. Their home was built of rough stone. Their clothing was simple and frequently patched. Their meals were modest, sometimes consisting of little more than bread, herbs, and water. Yet women from noble and influential families continued to arrive at the monastery, asking to exchange comfort for poverty and social prestige for silence. Among them were Clare's own sisters, Agnes and Beatrice. Even her mother, Ortolana, eventually joined the community. But the peace of San Damiano was fragile. The Italian territories of the 13th century were torn apart by political rivalries, military campaigns, and violent conflicts between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor Frederick II commanded forces that included Muslim soldiers from the settlement of Lucera in southern Italy. Medieval Christian chroniclers often referred to them as Saracens, a broad term used at the time for Muslim warriors. In 1240, according to the accounts preserved by Clare's community, imperial troops advanced through the region surrounding Assisi. They were not approaching as pilgrims. They came armed. News of the invasion moved through the countryside like a dark wind. Farmers abandoned their fields. Families gathered whatever possessions they could carry and fled behind the fortified walls of Assisi. Doors were barred. Church bells sounded warnings across the valley. San Damiano, however, stood outside the city's main defenses. The monastery had no soldiers. No towers protected it. No armed guards stood at its gates. Its residents were a small community of unarmed women who had taken vows of peace. As the enemy forces drew closer, the sisters could hear the terrible evidence of their approach. The pounding of horses, the clashing of metal, the shouting of commands, and the restless movement of men preparing to storm the property. Then the first soldiers appeared beyond the walls. Panic spread through the monastery. Some sisters rushed toward the chapel. Others cried openly, convinced that captivity or death awaited them. They understood what an invading army could do to an undefended religious house. There was nowhere safe to flee. Even if they escaped the building, the open fields surrounding San Damiano would expose them immediately. The walls that had once sheltered their prayers had become a trap. At the center of this terror lay Clare, confined to her bed by a serious illness. Years of severe fasting, sleepless prayer, physical hardship, and constant responsibility had weakened her body. By this stage of her life, she often suffered from exhaustion and could not move without assistance. She appeared to be the most helpless person in the entire monastery. But when the frightened sisters reached her room, Clare did not surrender to their panic. She listened to the noise outside. Soldiers had begun climbing the outer walls. The sisters begged her to pray for them. According to later testimony given during the investigation of her life, Clare ordered that she be taken to the monastery's entrance or placed where she could face the attackers. The women hesitated. Clare could barely stand. Carrying her toward the danger seemed unreasonable, perhaps even fatal. Yet her voice remained steady. She asked them to bring the small silver or ivory container in which the consecrated host was reserved. Popular artistic tradition would later depict her holding a large golden monstrance, although the elaborate form familiar today developed after her lifetime. The central meaning of the account remained unchanged. Clare chose the Eucharist as her only defense. The sisters lifted her from the bed. Every movement caused pain. Her body, wrapped in a coarse habit, seemed almost weightless in their arms. Slowly, they carried her through the corridors as the screams outside grew louder. The attackers had reached the enclosure. Hands appeared over the walls. Weapons struck against stone. The sisters gathered behind Clare, trembling and whispering prayers. Before them stood armed men hardened by war. Between the soldiers and the terrified women stood only a sick nun holding the Blessed Sacrament. Clare raised the sacred vessel. According to the testimony preserved in her canonization records, she prayed aloud, asking Christ not to abandon the women who had entrusted themselves to his protection. Her words did not sound like the command of a military leader. They were the plea of someone who possessed no earthly power and knew it. Then, tradition says, a voice was heard assuring her that the sisters would always be protected. What happened next was remembered as one of the most extraordinary events associated with her life. The soldiers suddenly stopped. The aggression that had driven them over the walls appeared to collapse without warning. Some accounts say they were struck by overwhelming fear. Others describe them losing their strength or falling backward from the walls. Confusion spread through their ranks as rapidly as panic had spread through the monastery. Men who had advanced without hesitation now began retreating. No arrows had been fired from San Damiano. No boiling oil had been poured from the roof. No hidden soldiers emerged from the chapel. Yet the attackers withdrew. The sisters watched in stunned silence as the armed forces moved away from the monastery grounds. The sounds of weapons and shouted commands gradually faded into the distance, leaving behind only the wind passing through the olive trees. Clare lowered the sacred vessel. Her hands were still weak. Her illness had not disappeared. The monastery walls remained as vulnerable as they had been moments earlier. But San Damiano had not fallen. The danger, however, had not vanished from Assisi. The following year, another military threat surrounded the city itself. Once again, Clare prayed for its protection, instructing her sisters to cover their heads with ashes and plead for mercy. The conflict outside the monastery was becoming more violent. While within its walls, Clare continued embracing disciplines that alarmed even those who admired her holiness. Her fasting had grown so severe that Francis and the Bishop of Assisi were compelled to intervene. During certain penitential seasons, she reportedly consumed almost nothing for several days each week. At times, she restricted herself to bread and water. Her companions feared that the body which had survived armed invaders might be destroyed by the relentless demands she placed upon herself. Clare obeyed the order to eat more regularly, but only reluctantly. Her physical strength continued to fade even as her influence expanded. From her bed, she governed the monastery, advised her sisters, corresponded with powerful women across Europe, and fought church authorities for the right of her community to remain completely poor. Outside San Damiano, armies threatened the region with visible weapons. Inside the monastery, another struggle was unfolding, One fought through hunger, illness, obedience, and an unwavering determination to possess nothing except the faith that had once confronted an army from a window, the phantom screen and the miracle of transmission. By the final years of her life, Clare of Assisi had become almost a prisoner. Within the monastery, she had helped transform into a sanctuary of radical poverty. Her spirit remained sharp, but her body had been weakened by decades of illness, fasting, sleepless prayer, and relentless sacrifice. The woman who had once crossed Assisi under the cover of darkness, resisted armed relatives at an altar, and confronted invading soldiers with the Eucharist, could now barely rise from her bed. The walls of San Damiano, which had protected her community from the violence of the outside world, had become the boundaries of her physical existence. Yet from that small and shadowed room, Clare continued to guide her sisters. She listened to their fears, settled disputes, received visitors, and dictated letters to women who lived far beyond Italy. Among her most famous correspondents was Agnes of Prague, a royal woman who had rejected marriage proposals and courtly privilege to embrace the same ideal of poverty. Clare's letters to Agnes revealed that physical weakness had not extinguished her inner fire. She wrote of Christ as a mirror in which the soul could see its true identity, inviting Agnes to gaze, consider, contemplate, and imitate. Clare's world had become smaller, but her influence was spreading across Europe. Her greatest struggle during those years was not against soldiers or her own family. It was against the possibility that the Church might force her community to abandon the absolute poverty she had promised to Francis. Church authorities feared that a monastery without property or guaranteed income could not survive. They repeatedly offered the sisters lands, privileges, and financial protection. Clare refused. She did not reject security because she loved suffering. She believed that owning nothing allowed her community to depend entirely upon God and to remain faithful to the life she had chosen on the night of her escape. Even popes found it difficult to change her mind. Clare requested what became known as the privilege of poverty, the extraordinary legal right for her community not to be forced to possess property. While her strength declined, she continued defending this ideal with the determination of someone protecting a sacred inheritance. Then came the night that would connect her name to an invention that would not exist for nearly 7 centuries. It was Christmas Eve, traditionally dated to 1252. Winter had settled over Assisi. Cold air moved through the valley, pressing against the stone walls of San Damiano. Inside the monastery, the sisters prepared to celebrate the birth of Christ. Lamps were lit, prayers were whispered, and anticipation filled the corridors. In previous years, Clare had participated in the sacred celebrations with her community, but that Christmas, her illness had become too severe. She could not be car-eyed safely to the chapel, much less travel to the solemn liturgy celebrated at the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. The sisters were eventually forced to leave her alone. One by one, the sounds of their footsteps disappeared down the corridor. The monastery grew quiet around Clare's room. She could imagine the candles glowing in the distant church, the friars gathering around the altar, and the voices beginning the ancient hymns of Christmas. But she could not see them. She could not hear them. For a woman whose entire life had revolved around the Eucharist and the rhythm of prayer, the separation was painful. She had surrendered wealth, marriage, comfort, and physical strength. Now even the celebration she loved was taking place beyond her reach. Clare reportedly began to weep. In the darkness of her cell, she prayed that she might somehow participate in the sacred mystery unfolding far away. She did not ask to be healed. She did not demand that her body suddenly recover. She simply desired not to be spiritually separated from the worship of that night. Then, according to the tradition preserved by her followers, something inexplicable occurred. The silence of her room was broken by distant voices. At first, the sound may have seemed like a memory, the echo of hymns she had heard many times before, but the voices grew clearer. Clare could distinguish the chanting of the friars, the words of the prayers, and the music of the Christmas celebration. The liturgy taking place at a distant church seemed to enter her room. Tradition further recounts that the celebration became visible to her, as though the stone wall before her had opened into another place. She watched the sacred rites while remaining confined to her bed. Distance appeared to collapse. The cold cell became, in a mysterious way, a window into the illuminated church. There were no glass lenses, no wires, no projected images created by human machinery. Yet Clare believed she was seeing and hearing events occurring beyond the walls of San Damiano. When the sisters returned, they expected to find her grieving over the Mass she had missed. Instead, Clare described the celebration and told them that she had not been completely absent. According to the religious account, she had heard the chants and witnessed the service as clearly as though she had been present among them. The story spread through the community and survived for generations. Centuries later, when moving images and sound could finally be transmitted into homes through television, Clare's Christmas vision took on a startling new meaning. In 1958, Pope Pius XII officially declared her the patron saint of television, recognizing the medieval tradition that she had received a distant image and sound while confined by illness. But on that Christmas night, Clare could not have imagined satellites, cameras, broadcast towers, or glowing screens. She knew only the darkness of her room and the mysterious presence that had entered it. Her illness continued to worsen. By the summer of 1253, those closest to her understood that she was dying. Pope Innocent IV visited San Damiano, and Clare once again pleaded for the confirmation of the rule she had spent years defending. On August 9th, only 2 days before her death, the papal approval finally arrived. The document was brought to her bedside. Clare received it with profound emotion. Her community had been granted the right to live without property, faithful to the poverty she had embraced when Francis cut her hair more than 40 years earlier. As death approached, the sisters gathered around her. Some wept openly, others prayed in silence. Clare, however, appeared to be listening to something they could not hear. According to the testimony of those present, she spoke softly to her own soul, telling it to go forward without fear because the one who had created it had also protected it. On August 11th, 1253, Clare died at San Damiano. The daughter of nobility who had escaped through the darkness, left behind no fortune, no palace, and no earthly possessions. Yet the room in which she died soon became a place of pilgrimage, surrounded by reports of healings and extraordinary favors attributed to her intercession. In 1850, centuries after her burial, workers searching beneath the Basilica of Saint Clare located a stone sarcophagus believed to contain her remains. The skeleton was found with traces of clothing and other materials. Later devotional preservation work produced the wax-covered figure now displayed beneath glass in the basilica, presenting the appearance of her body to pilgrims. Behind that glass lies the memory of the woman who once looked upon a distant Christmas liturgy without leaving her bed, an image carried not through wires or machines, but through a mystery that transformed the stone wall of a medieval cell into a silent, luminous screen.